Welcome back to a new episode of Skin to It, your guide to healthy skin.
I'm Marlo Sutton, fashion stylist and beauty enthusiast.
And I'm Dr. Sandy Skotnicki, your trusted dermatologist.
Today we're diving into an exciting topic.
We'll break down everything you need to know about how climate change may affect your skin. We'll share tips to help you care for your skin like a pro.
So grab your notepads and let's get skin to it.
So today we have a really special guest. We're going to be diving into a critical and timely topic about how climate change is impacting our skin health. And we couldn't have had a better guest than Dr. Misha Rosenbach. So just a little introduction, and thank you for joining us. Dr. Rosenbach is an associate professor of dermatology and internal medicine at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He is a recognized leader in complex medical dermatology, but he has this really incredible focus on the intersection of environmental changes and skin health. Beyond his clinical practice, he's at the forefront of research on climate change and how it can affect dermatology. He's co-authored 200 peer-reviewed articles, and for listeners who don't know what that means, that's a big deal. On topics including how UV radiation exposure and pollution can affect skin and skin conditions. And what I found really interesting when I read some of his research and listened to him at a clinical talk in Amsterdam is about how the prevalence of infections can be changed by environmental shifts in climate. He's the co-chair of the American Academy of Dermatology's expert resource group on climate change and environmental affairs. And he's really been a driving force behind integrating sustainability into dermatology and advocating for climate-conscious healthcare policies. We're going to explore this link between climate change and skin disease, the science behind pollution, rising temperatures, and how they affect our skin, and not only us as individuals, but industry, how we can protect ourselves and contribute to sustainability, not only in dermatology, but in the beauty industry. So Dr. Rosenbach, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and for highlighting this topic and for that lovely introduction. A pleasure to be here chatting with you guys.
You're very welcome.
So I'll just start us off. I mean, this is fascinating, very timely, very current. I love that we're having this conversation. And there's a lot of things I want to know, but I'm hoping one of the takeaways will be to understand how we can protect ourselves and how we can prepare ourselves, and our skin for the dangers that we're not even maybe considering really, or not even really thinking about. And, I'd love to understand how this became a primary interest for you, any stories you want to tell about how you really decided to focus on this.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sure we're going to spend a bunch of time talking about like stuff people can do. This will be a teaser for your podcast. We'll get to that. So I'll start with the first part of your question, which is how I got involved in this. And, the path to being a dermatologist is you go to, high school, college, medical school, then residency training. And while you're doing those things, you're not just studying for medicine, right? You have outside interests or you grow up caring about things. And so, I let's say grew up in the 80s, not to date myself, but, there's a lot of talk about acid rain or rainforests and things like that. And I liked going to the zoo and I liked nature and I cared about these things. But I always thought that was like, this is me as a person. And then I have like my medical career, and people have hobbies and interests and books and whatever outside of work. And I have those things too. But I felt like climate change and concerns about climate was a me thing, not a doctor thing. One of my roles at Penn is I was the director of the inpatient dermatology service. So we saw everyone who was hospitalized for skin issues. And at some point in kind of the late winter, we saw a cluster of adults who had something called hand, foot, mouth disease, which is you get like little vesicles or little sores on your hands, feet, and mouth. It's a well-named disease. And that's a disease that usually happens in kids. And it was a little uncommon for us to see like a cluster of adults hospitalized for severe hand, foot, mouth disease. And we presented it at an infectious disease conference. And this one infectious disease doctor said, oh, that's probably because it's been such mild winters. We've been predicting that as it's warmer and the weather is changing, we're going to see different patterns of diseases. And it turns out that hand, foot, mouth disease is a reportable illness in China. And they had done some modeling that showed like as it's hotter and more humid, you get more hand, foot, mouth disease. And so I was fascinated at this conversation with this ID doctor that was like, oh my gosh, this is climate change directly affecting what we're seeing in diseases that we see in patients right here and now. I never thought about this. And then when you delve into it and get start reading what's out there, there's actually a ton of impacts doing climate change in health, climate change in dermatology, climate change in medicine, and happy to talk about those or other things. But that's how I first merged my personal care with this is something that affects our patients and we should know about it as doctors.
And that's kind of a good segue. Like, I was sort of going to talk about what we are going to discuss in this podcast. And, I reviewed your journal, your article in the International Journal of Women's Derm, and I also read one in the Lancet, which is more about general health. But we're going to really focus on three areas: like skin cancer, and how climate change and pollution is maybe changing the UV index or what's coming through to the Earth's crust or the Earth's surface. Sorry, environmental pollution and its effect on premature aging, eczema, psoriasis, skin diseases, and then what you just talked about, infectious diseases and how they are changing with respect to climate change. And when I saw you in Amsterdam speak at the European Union, and you talked about that, I was like, I got to have this incredible guy on the podcast, because it was like I didn't know that. Like you kind of think about it, and when and it's intuitive in a way, but until somebody points it out to you, you don't really realize it's an issue. And I know the first question Marlo is really wanting to ask is about skin cancer.
Yeah. Sandy and I actually did, for this season of the podcast, a whole episode on skin cancer, and the fact that it is actually becoming more prevalent. And so I guess I'd love for you to talk to us about the direct correlation between the increase in the UV index and skin cancer and what you're seeing.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would say, for listeners, skin cancer is the most common cancer. Most skin cancers are actually pretty manageable. So if someone says, hey, you have skin cancer, that looks like skin cancer, that's not a reason to panic. It is a reason to be aware of it. And our general advice as like dermatologists is to be careful about sun exposure and wear sunscreen. None of that was your question, but I feel obligated to like mention some of those things. And so there's three main types of skin cancer: melanoma, and then the non-melanoma skin cancers, which is basal cell and squamous cell. And those second two are more common. And the first, melanoma, is a little bit more aggressive and more dangerous. And we've known for a long time that ultraviolet light comes, through from the sun onto Earth. And some of that ultraviolet light can hit your skin and cause DNA damage and increase your risk for both sun damage and cosmetic issues, and then also skin cancer. In a very, very simple way, as the sun, is sending energy to Earth, a lot of it is absorbed, a lot of it is radiated out into space. But as we emit more greenhouse gases, that basically puts a layer of, CO2 and methane and other heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, and that retains more heat. And so that's some of why we get global warming. And so, like, we're doing this podcast in February. I actually don't know where you guys are located, but I'm in the northern hemisphere, so we'll go it's the middle of winter. So I wore a lot of clothes today because it's cold, right? But in the summer, I wear less clothes because it's hot. So just logically, as the Earth is getting warmer, there is longer hot seasons when people are outside more, wearing less. And that is like a very simple, there doesn't have to be science to this. There doesn't have to be us explaining weird reactions between CO2 and ultraviolet light. We just know that as there's more warm seasons and longer warm seasons, sometimes people might spend more time outside.
You don't think it has anything to do with a bit of ozone depletion over the last years?
Definitely, so many other factors. That's the like. No one's going to dispute like the simple logic of that first statement. The next stuff gets a little bit more complicated. So one is there is an ozone layer. Ozone layer is complicated because again, in the 80s, there was a lot of concern about, are we losing the ozone layer and what's going to happen? And then there was a very effective international agreement that stopped the release of some ozone ozone damaging chemicals. And then as all countries came together and followed the science and made laws that limited the damaging emissions of something that's hurting the ozone layer has actually been coming back. And that's like a success story. But there are certainly still areas where the ozone layer is thin. But it's actually a little bit complicated with ultraviolet light and increased CO2 in the atmosphere. And there's a dermatology researcher in Europe who's done some work that shows that combination can increase photocarcinogenesis or UV light inducing skin cancer as a result of the higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. And so once you go from like, hey, it's hotter, we're outside more, maybe there's more sun exposure, to, oh, there's layers of ozone, and is that plus minus, and how much does that help or hurt, versus just the higher CO2, and how much does that help or hurt? The short answer is it's complicated, and we think that the rate of skin cancer is going up for a variety of reasons, including behavioral changes, but also potentially as a result of climate change.
We live in Toronto, Canada.
Oh yeah, and it's cold as
and it's
heck.
very cold. So we have many layers, but not right now when we're doing this podcast because we have to look nice. Okay, my next question is a little bit of a controversial one. So with these changes in UV radiation patterns, I mean, I know they're complex, like you just said. I don't know that the current SPF standards that we recommend our patients as dermatologists are adequate. Like in Canada, our statement is, use SPF 30. I actually recommend almost to all my patients 50 for a number of reasons. People don't apply sunscreen properly. And we did a really great episode on sunscreen controversies. The SPF is directly related to the quantity that you put on your skin. So if you put on less than you're supposed to, a shot glass for your whole body for an average adult, you're getting a lower SPF. Now, you also have just said that possibly what's coming through to the Earth's surface is even more problematic and more damaging because of CO2 emissions in the air. So my question is, are the current SPF standards that we recommend as dermatologists adequate in light of the climate change information?
The SPF is a confusing area. SPF, it's easier with graphics, but basically, like the sun protection factor is it's not a linear curve; it's sort of like an exponential curve. So SPF 30 gets you like 90 something percent protection. SPF 45 is also like 95% protection. SPF 60 is like 99%. Not that anyone should rush out and go get SPF 60 because I said that. So the evidence is, if people use something that's like SPF 200, they feel artificially super protected, and then they're less likely to reapply. So some of this is like a nudge effect. And so we know that to get their SPF labeling, sunscreens have to work for about 2 hours. So it turns out they work for about 2 hours. And so what's important is that use the right amount. And as you said, it's more than people use. Like people underutilize their sunscreen, but it's also that you reapply or that you just physically avoid the peak hours of the sun. So it's like 11 to 2, maybe you're in the shade instead of that's when you're out in the sun. But I would say like the shift from you're using SPF 30, the right amount, reapply every 2 hours and avoiding peak of sun, to the marginal benefit you'd get from changing that to SPF 45 is not worth the changing the consistent messaging of like, just use sunscreen, try to make it SPF 30, try to use the right amount, try to reapply every 2 hours, just to not confuse the message. But it's a really good question. It's something that should be monitored over time. And none of this is going to, or some of this is going to segue into, well, what about air pollution and how do you protect your skin from air pollution, which is one of the early hinted at questions that we teased in the beginning when Marlo asked, what should people do? But the last thing I do want to just mention, so you said you were born in the 70s. I was too. I said I grew up in the 80s, but born in the 70s. And the like, how does my hairspray hurt the atmosphere is that sort of thing is very relevant to the climate discussion, which is like, I drive my car, what difference can that make? But
Right.
if there's 8 billion people, you wouldn't sit in your garage with your car running because those emissions will be bad and you would die. No one should do that. But you don't think about, driving your car and where those emissions are going because that's normal life. But if 8 billion people for 50 years are driving their cars or 100 years, that stuff adds up and affects the environment on a global scale. So if everyone is spraying chlorofluorocarbons that are damaging the ozone layer, or if they're used in industrial processing or refrigerants and things like that, then that does add up. And that's the difference between like personal choice and societal choice and policy-based choices. That's also why we need science to study these things and why you shouldn't feel guilty about driving your car. It's not a personal issue. It's a societal issue and a political issue, and making it easier for people to do the right thing to protect the planet without affecting their ability to go about daily life.
So just to get back to sunscreens, because this is something Sandy and I were talking about. So we talked about the SPF factor, but do you think sunscreen, actually the formulation of the sunscreens needs to evolve, especially in the US? I know we have different regulations in Canada. What about the actual ingredients, like the new ingredients that are coming out, chemical ingredients in the actual sunscreens?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Honestly, there's so much we could talk about with this. So part of it is like Europe has some different approved things that are not available in America. I would imagine that Canada is probably
We have
between.
We have them. Yeah, we have we have Tinazorb and all the new UVAs.
So the U.S. approval of new sunscreen ingredients has been a little bit behind some other countries, and some of that gets at some regulatory challenges. There are still physical blockers, so like zinc and titanium, which is like when lifeguards put stuff on their nose and their nose is white, that provides a lot of barrier. That's like a physical sunscreen that doesn't have chemicals in it for people who are worried about some of the things that had come out about things like endocrine disruptors and things like that could be part of sunscreens. Since this is about climate change, I will say that there's a conversation about, do sunscreens harm coral reefs? So that's a separate thing that I don't know how much coral reefs there are in Canada, so this might not have reached you guys and your audience, but
No,
there.
no, it's a great. We talk about it, and I did quite a bit of research on it in the sunscreen episode. But I'd love to hear because I know what my conclusion was, but I want to hear yours.
Yeah. It's complicated because if you take like a tank of corals and put high concentrations of some
Yeah.
chemical sunscreens, it can be damaging. But the
Mhm.
ocean is a very big place, and it's not getting high concentrations of chemical sunscreens from humans putting it on their body and going swimming. But there
Mhm.
are chemical sunscreens that are used in industrial purposes, like for lawn furniture and things like that, to prevent sun bleaching, and the amounts are pretty big. And so we know that ultraviolet exposure causes skin cancer. So dermatologists say that we have to take care of our patients. Advising people to use sunscreen is important. And then if you say, well, you care about the environment, this climate change podcast, like, aren't you worried about coral bleaching from sunscreen? And I'd say, um, you have to look at it as like, what's the biggest component of this? So the reason corals are not doing well is because most of our fossil fuel emissions and heat trapping gases have led to increased heat in the ocean. So there's more ocean heat, but also a lot of that CO2 gets absorbed in the ocean, leads to ocean acidification. And so the things that are harming corals are like huge component of fossil fuels, smaller component of chemical sunscreens, probably in industrial use, tiny bit on people's skin. And if you're going to fix those things, it's better that people use sunscreen on their skin, protect from skin cancer, and then you fix the other things.
I totally agree, and you said that very well. And I said it something similar, but not as well as you. Actually, on that, before we leave this sort of topic, I wanted to just briefly touch on oral sun protective supplements. We touched on it again in our sunscreen episode, but the article in the New England Journal of Medicine about niacinamide, 500 milligrams twice a day in pill form, vitamin B3, how it might decrease the incidence of non-melanoma skin cancer, and oral sun protection pills from that fern, was it
Yeah.
polypodium heliocare. I mean, my question is, I didn't really put too much stock in that. Like, maybe for people that go south, like we have sunbirds and in Canada that go or somebody that lives in Australia, but with climate change and the increased incidence of potentially more problematic rays coming in, would you recommend these more often? What do you think about that for
Um,
our listeners?
yeah, I'm always careful when I say like things that I'm talking about with confidence and things that I'm like, you should talk to someone else about. So, not exactly my area of expertise. My personal take is the initial excitement about niacinamide protectiveness has not been borne out in follow up studies. And I think we have a lot of real world data about sunscreens and lack similar positive experiential benefits from some of these oral agents. But I also think they're relatively low risk and relatively well tolerated. And there are some people who are at particularly high risk of sun damage. There are some genetic diseases that increase your risk of skin cancer, and there's some special populations. But I would say, again, like, people get overwhelmed. And so it's like simple messages work, like a shot glass of sunscreen every 2 hours, avoid the peak hours of the day. That you can rattle off really quickly. You're like, you should use polypodium leucotomus extract and vitamin niacinamide, and people get the wrong one. I think we have simple messages that really affect population-based health, and everyone has so much stress and so much information, and so hard to keep up to things. Sometimes people start feeling like they're guilty if they're not protecting their children the right way or themselves the right way, and like, my friend uses this, and how come I don't? Like,
I love this. I love this conversation. I think, but part of the reason, Marlo and I, specifically, I wanted to do this podcast as a dermatologist is I want a place where people can actually get the information. So you just said, like, it's not robust science. It's not robust studies. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the topic that we already sort of alluded to a little bit, which got you sort of started down this path, which is the change in sort of vector-borne diseases. And vector, for listeners, is a disease that is, a vector is a mosquito or some other insect which is carrying an organism like a parasite or a bacteria or a spirochete, and it's going to transmit it to a human through when they suck blood out of you. So the change in climate temperatures and how that has manifested in some of these vector-borne and infectious diseases. Can you explain this to our listeners? I found it fascinating in your talk, and we talked a little about hand, foot, and mouth, but how about other diseases?
Yeah. So I would say a lot of this depends on where your listeners are and what they're used to, but very easily, right? Like in the middle of winter, you probably don't get mosquito bites, and in the middle of summer, you probably get mosquito bites, right? So that there's a reason for that. Like mosquitoes would like to be biting year round. Why aren't they there? Well, it depends on the weather and the climate and the environment. And so it turns out that the world has a bunch of different bands and zones, right? Like the equatorial zone has sun all the time and is the tropical region. And so there are some diseases we've always known about as tropical regions. And then you move like a little bit farther from the equator towards the poles and you get to like subtropical regions. And there's different things that live in subtropical regions. And then as the earth is warming, those regions are expanding. So like around the equator, the part that like is tropical is a little bit bigger. And the part that's subtropical is a little bit bigger. And if I say subtropical and I asked you to draw a line on the map, you guys would probably each draw like a different line, or all of your listeners would probably like guess at a different latitude that counts as subtropical. But like a lot of the continental US technically is now subtropical from climate change. And so there are some vectors that we thought of as causing disease in equatorial areas or tropical regions that we now see in the continental US. And if people are either in denial that this is happening or not staying up to date on information, what that means is they're not going to be expecting these diseases, or they're not going to think about testing for them, or there's going to be delayed diagnoses and worse outcomes for patients. And so it's just important for people, regardless of their beliefs, to just know the epidemiology of diseases and patterns of diseases that are changing. And for Canada, there's a great example. So you said you're in Toronto, I'm in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is like the world capital of Lyme disease. It's named for Lyme, Connecticut, but we have more Lyme here than anyone else. Very proud of it. But you can look on maps the geographic spread of Lyme. And so Lyme is caused by this black-legged tick called the Ixodes tick. And the tick bites you, and if it's on you for, let's say, more than about 24 hours, it can transmit Lyme if it has Lyme. And from a dermatologic standpoint, Lyme shows up with what's called the bullseye rash. So it's called erythema chronica migrans, but it's an expanding pink area of redness from the tick bite. It almost always happens if there's Lyme, and it almost is important. And if you diagnose it at that stage with this expanding redness, it's very easy to treat. Or if you recognize that the tick that's biting you could have transmitted it, you can even prophylactically treat. But if you miss early stage Lyme, advanced Lyme can be really bad and can be harder to treat and can even lead to some things like complete heart block, which is as bad as it sounds. And so the Ixodes, the black-legged tick that, Pennsylvania against the capital, if you look on a map, it's expanded outward, but it's expanded northwards. And so like when I spoke at the Canadian Derm Society about climate change, I was like, hey, how many of you have seen Lyme? Or how many of you learned about Lyme? And then we talked about it at dinner, and all of the older than me, more senior dermatologists said, when they trained, there was no Lyme in Canada. And all the younger than me, dermatologists are like, we see Lyme all the time. And if you look on a map in the last 10 to 15 years, there's a ton of Lyme in southern Canada, which is obviously where most people live. But it's really important that people are aware of this. And it's not just that it's moving, the Ixodes tick is moving northward as it gets warmer. It also bites earlier and later in the year because it's more mild winters. And so like we used to only see it in the spring, but now we see it in February. And again, if you're not prepared for that, you miss the diagnosis, you're not thinking about it, and your patients do worse.
I just want to make two comments there for our listeners. So the ticks, like they nothing really bites you. It burrows, it hangs on there, and you don't get like a redness. And the bullseye, which you're talking about, usually comes 2 or 3 months later. And it's important that patients understand that. I have definitely, I've been a dermatologist 28 years. I never saw Lyme. And I probably see a case or two a year now. And it's, again, has a lot to do with climate change. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And just tick bites. I mean, a friend of ours, we were up an hour from Toronto at the end of the summer, and she got a bad tick bite. She went and got antibiotics. Kim did.
Prophylactically.
Yeah, prophylactically.
Yeah. We're definitely seeing it. And you need the white-tailed deer. You need like the triad. But, it's definitely, that is something that from this episode of people should take away for sure.
So we also did, actually for this season, we did an episode on skin pigmentation. And Standy talked about studies in cities that show more changes in facial skin pigmentation that's actually coming from pollution. And so I guess as climate change increases pollution, can you talk about how it's causing more premature aging, skin
Triggering skin
pigmentation,
diseases. Yeah.
triggering different skin diseases.
Kind of moving on to pollution.
Yeah. That's such a great question and such an important topic. And I will say, for you guys are doing like a great job of highlighting like cutting edge things. So like, not a plug for your podcast, but like this is new stuff, and your readers or listeners should know that this is an evolving area of medicine.
Right.
And also, I think a lot of people get like climate anxiety. So just like as a brief plug, like all these things we talk about are scary, and also all of them feel too big to tackle. We have a lot of solutions, but you also have to understand like what you can control against or what you can protect from and what you can't and shouldn't stress about. So I don't know that we're even going to talk about microplastics. Terrifying. Can't do much about it. Really should be an area that we make progress on. We started with pollution. Dr. Sandy, like you, I'm sure have seen a lot of patients, and you could probably walk in and identify who smokes cigarettes and who doesn't.
Oh yeah.
Because
sure.
It's pretty easy to see a ton of, and that's like pollution right on your skin. Like you inhale the smoke and it lands on your skin. I think most dermatologists, after some experience, are able to see like the smoking damage on the skin. Pollution is less visible and less direct, but is just as real. And so there are some famous pictures in dermatology of like twins where one is a smoker and one's not, or truck drivers on the left side of their face versus the right side of their face. And for listeners, it's an audio medium podcast, but you can Google both of those. They're pretty striking. Probably all of your listeners probably use some creams on their skin or soap or whatever it is that people do. If you look out and look at a smokestack, like would you put your face in a smokestack? Like absolutely not. If you look in the top of your chimney, if you have like a fireplace, like it gets all sooty, right? You would never put that on your skin. So then the question is like, how much pollution and what percent that's going out into the environment is in the environment and landing on our skin, and what effect does that have? And so some of the cooler new studies, or scarier new studies, I don't know, interesting, good science new studies are the closer someone is to a highway, the more likely they are to have a skin problem like eczema or psoriasis. Right. And so we know that just like the distance to road that has a lot of cars, that stuff causes skin disease. And we have growing similar data for like, does your zip code have a coal power plant in it? And what's the air quality and how does that affect inflammatory skin disease? And if you shut down that coal plant, how much does that help the overall health, not just skin health, but the overall health of that community? And so the short answer is we're learning a lot about this, and there's a lot more to learn. The take home point is pollution's bad, and it's bad for your skin. It's probably bad for your eyes and your lungs also. And then that's sort of the ambient pollution that's out there. Canada and the US are buddies in a lot of ways. One of the ways is wildfire and wildfire smoke. So like, you guys have had a ton of wildfires. We talk about ambient pollution, like what's just out there on a daily basis, and whether we should look at the air quality index and how can you protect yourself from that. But then you look at spikes of pollution. So if there's a wildfire and that smoke lands on your skin, there's data that shows that in the week or two after wildfire smoke, there's increased visits to the dermatologist for flares of itch and for flares of eczema. And so we have a lot of growing body of evidence that like what's in the air lands on your skin and affects your skin in ways that we really have to understand better and have to develop ways to educate patients and allow them to protect themselves during those periods too.
I wanted to mention a really interesting story. My subspecialty interest is allergic contact dermatitis. And I had a fellow who had bad atopic dermatitis, atopic eczema. And for the listeners, this is a genetic rash that is itchy and red and scaly and often occurs in various parts of the body and face. And he was a very successful businessman. He had to go to China. And this was years ago before we had all these fancy drugs for eczema. And he would come back and he would always flare incredibly. Now, part of it's the stress of the flying and the time change, but he really thought it was the air quality. And he was so bad that I put him on cyclosporin and I patch tested him right before I took him off it. And he was severely allergic to formaldehyde. And so formaldehyde is one of those things in pollution. It's also in wildfire smoke. And so for him, he was so allergic to the formaldehyde, he actually had to, this is again before biologics, he stopped going to China because it was just too bad for his
Yeah.
skin. And that's kind of my little early climate change story.
Sure, yeah.
But I wanted this is a good segue into wildfires. Like we do live in Toronto. We had to deal with the fires from
In
Quebec.
yeah.
And so again, we sort of touched on it early, but protecting ourselves from pollution or the particles, the volatile particles, carcinogens in smoke, physical sunscreen.
Yeah. You touched on a bunch of great stuff, and I don't want to like go back and talk through some of the things you commented on. I'll answer your question in a second. Mostly it comes to we don't know though, but
Mm-hmm.
just like brief, like climate change is. So you said we live in Toronto, so we had the wildfires from Quebec. So I live in Philadelphia. I also had the wildfires from Quebec. Like that
Yeah,
smoke
you do.
went all down and all over. And honestly, the plumes of smoke from wildfires in California, wildfires in all different provinces of Canada, the plume of smoke goes so far that it extends over Greenland. And so Greenland is like a big glacier, right? It's a big
Mhm.
ice sheet, but that's white. So the white ice usually reflects a lot of energy. When there's
Mm.
wildfire smoke, it lands soot on the glacier and it turns black, and then it absorbs more heat and accelerates glacial melt. So like
Wow.
that's like a one little anecdote of like how complicated this is, but that's also
Right.
like climate
Wow.
scientists know this and they include that in these models because they do awesome work. And there's so much stuff that like we're having like a dermatologic based conversation about climate sustainability, but there are a lot of people who do have dedicated their lives to studying this, and like the mathematical models and the data and things like that feed into this are really incredibly complicated and important for us to listen to. And so you said like, how do we protect our skin? The truth is you should support transitioning away from fossil fuels. So,
Yeah.
solar power is the cheapest energy. The scale of growth of solar power is amazing, and it's not going away anytime soon. And so, it's cheaper to buy and build a new solar field than it is to run an existing coal plant. And honestly, that's not the answer that you or your listeners want. But the truth is that these are big societal level problems, and we do have to follow the science and do what we know we can do and should do to mitigate future bad effects of climate change. So we don't have to get into like personal lives. I don't know if you guys have kids or your listeners have kids, but the question is like, well, we could talk about the creams that you might want to or not put on, but we also want to make sure that for the next generation after that, that global warming is limited to 1.5 or 1.8 or 1.9, all of which is better than 2.1, and 2.1 is better than 2.2. And so there's not like a hard
Mhm.
cutoff. It's the more effect we do now, the better environment we leave for generations to come. Not
I love how you like how you look at things. And our next question was kind of that. So I think I'll answer it because it was what can we do? Because some of the listeners are gonna, what can I put on my skin to protect? So I was at a meeting and it was also in the American Academy Journal of one of our most powerful antioxidants is stable vitamin C, 10 to 15%. And they looking at it as not just as an antioxidant, but they did minimum erythema dose, which is called MED, which is basically when you get sunburn, and the vitamin C can decrease the minimum erythema dose, so it can help protect against sun damage. And I think probably what does pollution do to the skin? It causes inflammation. Inflammation damages our collagen and elastin. So if you use antioxidants, and I mean, this company was trying to sell their serum as this is going to prevent premature aging, and I think too, if you want to use something, the science is there for stable vitamin C, 10 to 15%, with or without, ferulic acid, which acidifies it. So that is the answer to the question. That and a physical sunscreen, and of course, on a big screen is let's move away from fossil fuels.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I would say the perfect answer, and I agree with everything you said. And there's a whole conversation to be had about like, well, what helps with aging, and is aging pollution versus sun and all those things, which is podcast. I'm just like probably 10 podcasts in and of itself for a dermatology standpoint. But the one thing is we talked about a lot of, you mentioned UV index. We've talked a lot about sunscreen, right? So like Marlo, you're not a dermatologist, but like you've heard of UV index, right? You've heard of sunscreen. None of this is new. But like air quality index is something that when there were wildfires, I bet you looked on your phone and you saw what
Mhm.
the air quality was. And I bet when you look at your weather app on your phone, it tells you things like UV index and air quality, but no one really necessarily pays a lot of attention to that in their routine life. But you've heard of UV index, and now with wildfires, you've heard of air quality index. So it's not crazy to think of a year to 5 years to 10 years in the future that someone says, hey, the air quality is really bad. You should use cream X and
Right.
whatever's in it. And this is going to be a whole new field. And so
Right.
I will predict right now that in your 2026 podcast, you have a conversation about smoke creams and 2028 and
God,
30.
I hope not. I hope not.
Well, I mean, I'm seeing it already for
Yeah.
sure.
It's just another horizontal segmentation of the market to sell a product. But you're right. There's probably we're going to see more of those coming. Yeah.
So if you can just end actually on what you're working on or like the future. So as the co-chair of the American Academy of Dermatology's expert research group on climate change and environmental affairs, what's the future?
Yeah.
What's happening?
I should fess up, as this is a podcast, I'm supposed to say that I'm speaking on behalf of myself as an individual and not on behalf of the American Academy of Dermatology. So the stuff I say is for like Dr. Rosenbach's point of view, not necessarily representative of the entire AAD, although I think we do a good job of representing most accurate and up-to-date science across the board. I think, some of the interesting things are, so you mentioned biologics for eczema. So people with eczema, we didn't have that many treatments in the past. Now we have a whole bunch of new treatments. One of the treatments is a biologic injectable. It's called Dupixent, and another of the treatments, broad category. There are a few biologics. I don't want to favor one company over another, but that's, I think, the largest, most commonly used. And then I have no conflict of interest. The other is an oral class of drugs called JAK inhibitors, and there are a number of them. And the one that was compared head to head in terms of side effects and efficacy was Dupixent versus a drug called upadacitinib, is the drug name. And so the JAK inhibitor, upadacitinib, is an oral medicine, so you get a bottle of pills. The Dupixent is injectable medicine, so it has to be delivered in styrofoam with dry ice to your house. And so when doctors are deciding what to do for their patients, they're like, what works best? What's safest? What can you afford? What has least side effects? That should always be true.
Right.
But when you go
I
to
know
the
where this is
store and you're
going.
trying to decide what food to eat, you look at like the calories, right? You're like, hey, this has 70% saturated fat. Maybe I don't want to eat it. Or this is super healthy. So imagine prescriptions had that same information on it that was, this drug is exactly the same as this drug in every way, except this drug has a carbon footprint of 1,000,000 and this drug has a
Right.
carbon footprint of 1. Which would
I'm
you
so
choose?
glad. I'm so glad you're talking about this.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's, I think, an important topic of like, do we look at the life cycle impact of stuff that we recommend? And
Right.
should that be part of clinical care guidelines and things that are published to help guide doctors? And again, no one's saying use what's worse for patients. People are saying
Right.
have the information available so that if all things are equal, this is a tiebreaker, or it's something that we should ask companies to look at so that we're able to incorporate it in the future. I think that's one big thing. Microplastics are scary. And so, I don't want to like freak out your visitors, but it's found in placentas. There was a study that came out this week that was like, you have a spoonful of plastic in your brain. That is the average amount of plastic in human brains now. 99% of fish have microplastics. Um, that's scary, and you can't do much about it. Like, someone's gonna be listening, like, what can I Google for my water filter, or I'm never eating fish again. And like, the answers are just, well, we have to be better about not putting plastic out into the environment, and we have to develop ways to deal with it.
Just to reiterate for the listeners, so the drug that you're talking about, it's a big sort of pen. It looks like a pen. It's all plastic, and it comes in this big box, and it comes in this like packaging, and you have to inject it, and the injection takes seconds, but you have all of this packaging. I've been at meetings. I was invited to some meeting, and they were talking about some skincare, and the cream. It was a tiny bottle. Then it came inside of a box, and then it was in another box, and then it was covered all in plastic. And everyone's asking all these questions about the ingredients. I stand up and go, "You need better packaging. Like this is not. This is really the opposite of sustainability. You got you got a plastic, then you got a box, then you got another box, then you got a bottle, then you got a plastic cap. And that's where a lot of this stuff never actually reaches recyclables. That's where TerraCycle is great.
Yeah.
Anyway, I could talk to you forever. You're so insightful, and I love the way the lens of that you look at things. It's fascinating. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
We both want to thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you both so much. Yes, absolutely lovely.
Please let us know what you thought of today's episode.
If you have any questions or thoughts, send me a message on social at Dr. Sandy Skotnicki. And don't forget, all the links and resources we mentioned are in the show notes.
And if you haven't already, please subscribe and leave us a review. It helps us to bring you the content you love.
Until next time, take care, and we'll see you next week on Skin to It.